Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance. The Senate this afternoon reached a deal on a bill to avert a rail strike. Here's NTD's Melina Wisecup with more details.
The legislation received strong bipartisan support, a vote of 80 to 15. The House already passed the bill yesterday, so now it's off to the White House for the president's signature. The agreement includes a 24% pay hike over 5 years and 5 $1,000 payments. While the Democrat-controlled House approved a separate measure to offer rail workers more sick paid leave, this proposal did not garner enough support in the Senate.
President Biden meeting with the French president today at the White House, but it comes amid rising transatlantic tensions over some of Biden's policies. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
With hugs and kisses, President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife to the White House. The leaders vowing unity between the two countries.
France is our oldest ally, our unwavering partner in freedom's cause.
At the top of their agenda is voicing support for Ukraine. And Biden says this about meeting with Putin.
I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet.
But aside from common ground, there's also some tension between the two nations. Before meeting Biden on Thursday, Macron openly criticized the Inflation Reduction Act. The Biden-backed legislation includes heavy incentives for U.S. climate technologies, but Macron says that's unfair for European businesses.
But as they were not properly coordinated with the European economies, they create just the absence of a level playing field.
Meanwhile, after the two met behind closed doors, Biden said this about the legislation that angered many in Europe.
The United States makes no apology. There's obviously going to be glitches in it and need to reconcile changes.
Biden was also pressed on domestic issues, such as the looming rail strike. Biden saying this about the consequences of not having a deal and having a nationwide strike.
It's going to immediately cost 750,000 jobs and cause a recession.
And more on the French visit. Biden will have his first state dinner tonight since taking office. And on the menu, over 200 Maine lobsters, a variety of American cheeses, and some orange chiffon cake for dessert. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
And the United States Senate is beginning to hold hearings on the collapse of the crypto giant FTX. But reports show that the same lawmakers have also received contributions from FTX. Founder and former CEO of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, has donated nearly $40 million to political candidates over the past 2 years. He gave tens of thousands of dollars to the members of the Senate Agriculture Committee this past election cycle, the very committee that is beginning to probe FTX. Committee Chair Debbie Stabenow and Ranking Member John Boozman received around $23,000 each. Both said they are donating the funds to charity. Other senators who received money from FTX include Kristen Gillibrand, Tina Smith, Cory Booker, Dick Durbin, Mitch McConnell, John Thune, and Joni Ernst. Now, to help us understand the collapse of FTX and what consequences it might bring to the crypto sector, we have chief economist and global strategist at Euro-Pacific Capital and host of the Peter Schiff Show podcast, Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Peter, there's a lot of heat on crypto right now, mostly because of the FTX debacle. Sam Bankman-Fried last night spoke at an event. What are your thoughts on what he said?
Well, I didn't hear what he said, but, I wish I would have taken a deeper look into Sam Bankman-Fried earlier, because I think I would have ferreted out the fraud pretty quickly, just like I did with Celsius. I just had one debate with Mashinsky, and I immediately knew he was running a Ponzi, and I called him out during the debate. And this operation was similar in that they were paying yield on crypto. How could you do that? Cryptos don't generate yield. The only way to generate yield is to take tremendous risk, which is exactly what he did. except the people who were depositing their crypto didn't appreciate the risk that was being taken. Of course, they were taking a lot of risk themselves just owning crypto, because all these currencies are basically worthless. They're not even really currencies. They're collectible tokens. But pretty soon, nobody is going to want a Bitcoin collection or any of these collections, and the prices are going to implode.
Peter, a lot of fund managers are actually expressing sympathy to him now, saying that they believe, his naivete, if you will, versus, consciously defrauding people. What is your take?
Well, I don't really know to the extent that what he did was criminal or just, gross incompetence and negligence. I don't really have enough information, but he was a young kid. I mean, he just turned 30. But, you would think that some of these hedge fund managers that invested with him would have done a little bit of due diligence. But this just shows you the way investors will act when they're drunk on cheap money. So I would blame the Federal Reserve for a lot of people acting as foolishly as they did, because maybe he was a kid, but there were a lot of grown-ups that were giving him money.
Peter, I have to ask you about your thoughts on the overall state of the economy. A lot of volatility in the markets. What is your thought?
Well, the U.S. economy is an absolute disaster. I mean, thanks to Fed policy over the last decade or so, we have a gigantic bubble. We never had a real recovery. We just had a financial bubble, and we dug ourselves into a much deeper hole than the one the Fed put us in 2008, following the financial crisis that they also created with the same type of monetary policy that is creating the crisis that we're heading for, which is going to be far worse than what we experienced in 2008. I mean, not only is inflation going to get much worse than it already is, but we're going to have a worse financial crisis than the one we had in 2008. So this is going to be the worst recession that the U.S. has ever experienced. It may even be worse than the Great Depression. It will certainly feel worse for most people, because in the Depression, at least people got the relief of falling prices. This time, consumers are going to feel the sting of dramatically higher prices.
So, Peter, with that said, I've heard you mention before that you believe that the third quarter growth and the factors involved are temporary. Could you break that down for us?
Sure. The only reason we had positive GDP in Q3 was because of a big improvement in our trade deficit. Now, we still had a huge trade deficit. It just wasn't as big as it had been in the prior couple of quarters. That was thanks to two factors. One, the strong dollar, which is now reversing. The dollar just had its worst month in 12 years, and it's falling again sharply today. So that's going to push the trade deficit up. In fact, the trade deficit in November that was released yesterday swelled by 10%. It was a huge jump. But the other factor that helped bring down the trade deficit was all the oil that Biden released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Oil companies were able to buy that oil and then export it. And so that artificially boosted our exports, which improved GDP. But pretty soon we're going to run out of the oil in the Strategic Reserve. There won't be a reserve left. And so we won't be able to rely on that crutch. So I think Q4, I mean, the economic news that came out yesterday and today was horrific. So I think we're going to have a big negative number for Q4 GDP. And so we're going to end the year on a low note. And I think we're going to have another negative quarter in Q1 of 2023.
And what are you seeing between the lines when you see that retail sales are up?
Well, they're not really up. I mean, prices are up. So if you factor in inflation, retail sales are down. In fact, look, construction spending numbers came out today and they're down, but construction costs have skyrocketed. So the fact that spending is down, even though the cost of building has soared, that tells you that construction projects have ground to a halt really in this country. People are just not building because nobody can afford to buy what gets built.
Peter Schiff, really appreciate your perspective.
Anytime.
Worldwide protests have broken out calling for an end to the Chinese Communist Party. Protesters gathered here in Washington, D.C. just last night, and a U.S. Senator today saying this is just the beginning. This as Senate Leader Chuck Schumer talks about a plan meant to help American companies decouple from the Chinese Communist regime. Here's NTD's Melina Wisecup with more.
Protesters are standing up worldwide in opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. Specifically, many are speaking out against the Chinese Communist Party's COVID lockdown measures, which led to the death of 10 people in the Xinjiang region after they could not escape their apartments during a fire because of those strict security measures. But more broadly, protesters can be heard at these gatherings calling for the Chinese regime's end. Protests have sparked here in the U.S. in different areas from New York to California and here in D.C. last night. And there is another one here in Washington, D.C. this Sunday. We caught up with Senator Braun from Indiana earlier. Here's his message to those protesters.
People finally saying enough is enough, being under the thumb of an autocratic system like theirs. And I hope they keep persisting, because I think this is just the start of a country that has largely gotten by with doing things that most places across the world wouldn't consider normal. And I think it's a limitation to their own economy growing if they're going to keep such an autocratic political system.
And Senator Braun, along with some other lawmakers, were not very happy about the way the White House responded to these protests, saying that it should have been a stronger stance with the people protesting and standing in opposition to the regime. But this is a tough position for the administration to be in because of how closely linked the U.S. economy and China's economy are. As an example, the Secretary of Commerce said earlier this week that the U.S. is not looking to decouple completely from China, but that their goal is to, quote, promote trade and investment in areas that don't threaten our core economic and national security interests or compromise human rights values. But both parties are more or less on the same page with regards to lessening our economic dependence on the Chinese regime. Senate Leader Chuck Schumer today on the Senate floor expressing his agreement with the Trump administration in this area. Here's a look.
The previous administration, one of the few areas they went forward on that I agreed with, got rid of Huawei, because it gave the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party too much influence. Well, the same thing will happen with these chip makers, these Chinese military contractor chip makers.
And that amendment that Senator Schumer is referring to, he and Senator Cornyn, a Republican, are working to get that into the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, which the Senate is expected to vote on in the coming weeks. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at EpochTV.com.